स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वप्रकाश वल्लेश गुरु गुहा स्वप्रकाश वल्लेश गुरु गुहा देव सनेश स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वप्रकाश वल्लेश गुरु गुहा स्वप्रकाश वल्लेश गुरु गुहा देव सनेश स्वप्रकाश वल्लेश गुरु गुहा देव सनेश स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु मां स्वामीनाथ परिपालयशु
शशिमण्डल कानन कुण्डल शिर शशिमण्डल कानन कुण्डल शिर शशिमण्डल कानन कुण्डल शिर शशिमण्डल कानन कुण्डल शिर शशिमण्डल घर घर अलख जगाए
Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, produced by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at Darbar Hall. Today we have a book launch, the first edition, 5 Decades of India's Built Environment by Dikshu Kukreja. A decade into the new millennium, Technology metamorphosed by upgrading the functions and design sensibilities it was able to bring into architecture. Promoting sustainable development, the designs reflect a futuristic aesthetic where the structures are responsive to their environment. At the same time, the designs are also curated to address the present day issues, bringing with them a sense of responsibility. In a surge for meaningful design responses to in India's urban environment, while imbibing the tenets of sustainability, this book captures the transformations that have taken place through the lens of a leading multidisciplinary architecture and engineering practice, C.P. Kukreja Architects. Dikshu Kukreja is an architect holding a B Arch as a gold medalist from the School of Planning and Architecture and a master's in architecture and urban design from Harvard University. He was elected as the founding vice president of Asia GST, which grew to become one of the largest student organizations at Harvard University. His firm, C.P. Kukreja Architects, CPKA, ranks among the top 100 architecture firms globally and among top 5 in Asia. Arunima Kukreja is a writer, interior designer, and philanthropist who heads the CPKA Foundation for Design Excellence as the creative head of the series Deciphering Design with Dikshu that aired on Disney Plus Hotstar. She, along with Dikshu, explored different facets of design and how they influence our everyday lives. Dikshu will also be in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts and is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, producers of the Jaipur Literature Festival and JLF, along with 25 other festivals across the world, and is the founder trustee of the Salam Balak Trust, providing support services for street and working children in Delhi. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me now call upon stage Arunima Kukreja to share a few words about the session and the book. Please also a big round of applause. Thank you.
I would just like to correct that, authored by Arunima and Dikshu Kukreja, even though Dikshu is far more educated in the field. A non-architect married into a family where there are 3 generations of architects, I was often drawn into conversations about our built environment. Being a student of history, I slowly began to appreciate the nuances of architecture and the story it stands to tell. India is a country that has gone through immense transformation in the last 5 decades, and each decade symbolizes a significant era, replete with its political, social, economic upheavals and consequent strong design trends. Once driving down the ring road of Delhi, I was taken up by all the buildings designed by the firm, right from the Army Hospital in Dhola Kuan to the NAFID building, and of course, all others that dotted the city, like the Ambadeep office. Some of them were new, some decrepit, some partially hidden by the canopies of large trees. What struck me was how distinct the architecture of each of these buildings was, and how this so very beautifully stood to represent the decade in which they were built. There was an urgent need to archive, document, and gather material on all these projects, which sadly was missing in a lot of them, and to bring to the fore the design ideology behind them. Literally rummaging through materials of over 50 years of the firm, I began to see how adventurous and ambitious a lot of these built spaces were, and how a lot of these large public spaces, which is the forte of the firm, became cauldrons of ideas, ideologies, and gatherings, like the Jawaharlal Nehru University. So while the Jawaharlal Nehru University, built in the early 70s, was a symbol of rising modern indigenous architecture in post-independent era, the signature towers in Gurgaon, built in the post-liberalization era of the 90s, saw India open its arms out to the digital world, with signature towers being one of the first advanced curtain glazed buildings in India, and of course, yet being sustainable. The new millennium, the first decade of the new millennium, also saw certain projects like the Pathways School, which was a step towards globalization, yet retaining its roots in the indigenous architecture. So the book is really a representation of all the transformations that have taken place in our built environment through the lens of C.P. Kukreja Architects. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. May I now please invite Mr. Dikshu Kukreja to say a few words on stage before we also launch the book with Mr. Hans Jacob Frydenlund, the ambassador of Norway to India.
Good afternoon. I would like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers. I'm just absolutely stunned by the inspirational environment I'm sitting in and experiencing. GLF is incredibly a world-class festival, and I have to compliment Sanjoy and his colleagues for creating something like this. I think it's fascinating. I cannot but also thank Navdeep Suri for having introduced me to this new world. 5 decades of India's built environment is truly a journey for us, which has been not just of creating a built environment, but also experiencing as it comes along. So I think it's something that I have also felt is sadly missing in the Indian architectural world, and that is the ability to actually document and present what we go about creating. Indian architecture, which means every single ounce of my blood, my heartbeat goes for Indian architecture and Indian design. And I think when I see we travel around the world and you talk to people, you have conversations, and you see how people reminisce about the historical Indian architecture. But what has happened post-independent India? Something is missing, something where people don't realize that there has been a transformation, and that cannot be experienced by people unless it's documented. So that's what this book is about, that we decided that the first 2.5 decades post-independence was really about what we saw in the previous session, what was being talked about, heritage of words. There was so much of grief or challenges that India was overcoming, whether it was about still fighting poverty, famines, droughts, etc. So those first 20 years, I think India was just barely standing on, independent India was barely standing on its feet. But starting the 70s is where we see major steps taking place in Indian architecture, decade after decade. And that's what this book has tried to capture. And since our firm has also been around for 5 decades, it was a nice perspective to see it through the lenses of CPK. So I look forward to sharing my thoughts with Sanjoy on this book, and I invite you all to also delve into it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now please invite on stage the ambassador of Norway to India, His Excellency Hans Jacob Frydenlund, excuse my mispronunciation if any, to say a few words and announce the launch of the book. Please, a big round of applause for all our panelists today.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to launch this book. We are now in a period where the issue of sustainability becomes more and more acute. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. And even though we think normally it's about transportation, well, let's get the petrol out of the cars and we're safe. No, building and living is one of the biggest challenges to the climate. So building sustainable is then one of our major challenges in the time coming. And it's good to be here to launch a book, document the history up to now. We need to know the history to actually make the path forward to the future, getting the inspiration. And I really want to thank Arunima and Dikshu for making this book, and I'm looking forward, and it's on for me now to officially launch it.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that you're not joining us, considering you're the co-author of the book. So we should have actually had you with us too. Dikshu, thank you so much for introducing design and architecture into the Jaipur Literature Festival. What you showed us was absolutely wonderful work. Delhi, the city that many of us come from, and of course Jaipur, which is where we are, you've seen the progression of architecture, whether it's in Jaipur, it's from the old city of Amer to the pink city to what is now the new city. In Delhi, from whether it was Pithogarh to Mehroli, to Siri, to Tughlaqabad, to Shahjahanabad, and of course then to New Delhi. And now it rests permanently in what is called Punjabi Baroque architectural style, which is much of South Delhi. And then came Gurgaon, which was a whole new world, in many ways similar to the Dubais and the Singapores. But what of Indian architecture? And with that, two questions. What of Indian architecture and how is that reflective in today's world? And when we sit in places like that, what in this is Indian? And how can we sort of create that experience of the India outside and bring it into the outside, inside?
So, Sanjoy, I think it's rather ironical that if we are to travel to any of these cities that you have named, there is such a repertoire of architecture and architectural heritage that there can be volumes documented about it. So when we come from a country where there is such a background and such a rich history to Indian architecture, it does become rather surprising that, post-independence, when we are actually independent and we were free to choose what direction we wish to take, including in our architectural preferences, we seem to have lost somewhere our vision and our direction, because one city after another, and whether it's the Gurgaon of today that you are referring to, or many other cities which strangely in India want to emulate being the Gurgaons of the world, or the Bandra Kurla BKCs of Mumbai, one finds that we are completely ignorant of what we can actually be inspired from our own architecture. And I'm not saying this because we are trying to here romanticize the past without any meaning to it, but it's when you look at buildings, when you travel around in Jaipur itself, and you look at the architectural elements, each of them have actually a climatic context to it, or a cultural context to it, or a sustainability design quotient to it, just like the ambassador just mentioned about. So when that has been the inspiration for including those kind of elements or having that kind of direction in architecture, and I'm referring to the jali, which you see, the jali or the screens in Rajasthan, architecture of Rajasthan and architecture of North India for that matter, I feel that somewhere we have probably, alluding to what I just mentioned a moment ago, that we need to be first delving into our own Indian architectural heritage and then being able to take it into a more modern interpretive manner. Many times, what you just commented upon, the Punjabi Baroque, it's because architecture is become something like a lipstick architecture, where you make a building and then you decide what you want to, make the facade as. That's not what architecture is about. Architecture is inspirational.
One of the things, Dikshu, you talked about is how older designs and architecture looked at the environment. In Varanasi, for those of you who've been, I don't know whether you've walked on the ghats, you'll see the buildings with the walls that are going up to prevent the waters, the flood waters coming in. Those buildings have niches where birds could come and sit. You talked about ignorance. Dikshu, why isn't architecture, design, and aesthetics taught from lower sort of from kindergarten levels? Why do we have to wait to be able to graduate to learn about architecture and design? What do we need to change in the school and the education system to be able to bring back or create futuristic cities, but which are very much founded on the Indian architectural pattern, which is good for us?
So now that we all are really realizing that with climate change, we are sitting on a ticking time bomb, which was referred to today in the keynote speech as well, we all need to understand that whatever we build, and by the way, 40% of the carbon emissions which are created in the world are in the construction industry, real estate and construction. So we really need to take a serious look at that. So from that perspective, I think the way we can do that sensible architecture is by looking back at our roots. With that comes the thought of what you are referring to, that how do we look back at the roots? We need to start doing that right from kindergarten. And I would say that I'm not saying this because I'm an architect. I would say this for the entire cultural diaspora that India has. It's about art and architecture. So for example, Arunima just mentioned about the Pathways World School, which was designed on the Aravali Hills in Gurgaon. There we were inspired by the site. And for me, it was not, I felt that when you're designing a school, then here's an opportunity that you actually bring art, sculpture, mosaics, murals, etc., out in the open environment. So in that campus, when you walk around, you are always encountering all kinds of Indian historical sculptures and artwork. Because for me, education begins not just sitting in a classroom or an art studio, but it's by walking around. When we all travel to European cities or elsewhere in the world, we are inspired by what we see around. So that's what I felt would be a good beginning for anyone to start appreciating art and architecture.
As you become successful, you have the trophy wife or the trophy husband, the trophy kids, the trophy holidays, and then you have your trophy new home or your trophy new office complex. In the terms of it being reflective of your own personality, we tend to be looking outside to the West for inspiration. What do we need to do to be able to ground ourselves in our own traditions, be proud of who we are and what we are? Again, as you looked around Jaipur, for example, some of the buildings are astonishing, whether it's day or night. How do we change that? How do we create a new sense of design?
So let me answer that more in a philosophical way. I feel that always as human beings, we yearn for something that we don't possess. So therefore, I feel my generation, for example, or even my father's generation, even more so, we were still to be exposed to the world. And therefore, we were yearning to go out there and see what was in the world. And we were infatuated. We were overwhelmed with what we saw. And I think the best thing that many people decided to do was what they saw, they wanted to bring back to India. Now, today's generation, the millennials, they are far more exposed right from a very, very young age because of technology, etc. They know what's going on around the world. And they are far more traveled also, a lot of them. So therefore, I think the appetite has satiated. You have seen what the world has to offer. And now people are beginning to look back at your own roots. Because you know that, you know what, we ourselves have a lot to offer to us. So therefore, I think there is a change that is beginning to come. I see that in our profession, and I find that a very positive development, that people are now no more saying, I want a building to look like something I saw in Germany or something I saw in France. But people are beginning to say, you know, we've traveled in India, we've seen some very inspiring work around. Is there something that you can do? But obviously, we don't want those 3 feet thick walls. So how do you modernize it? But at least people are beginning to appreciate what we have here.
What's been most interesting, Dikshu, and I don't know any of you have traveled into places like Houston and other parts of Texas and Colorado, is that you go to Houston and you go to some of the richer or the wealthier neighborhoods, and the billionaires have a city palace, and you have the Taj Mahal. And I was absolutely gobsmacked because this particular billionaire had built his city palace because they didn't want to come to India to do the wedding in summer. So they built the city palace in Houston to do the wedding of their child, and they wanted to do the Sangeet in the city palace. So Indian architecture has traveled through this very wealthy NRI sort of affluent system. Has it traveled well? Does our architecture make sense in other parts of the world?
I think it does. It depends in what layer, up to what layer you are trying to understand it. Like I said, if it's only something which you are looking at a very superficial level, it starts becoming out of context. But if you start looking at it deeper inside, so for example, the part of the country we are sitting in, you know, courtyards play such an important element. Courtyards are the breathing lungs of a building. and they become very important. Similarly, the element of jali, it becomes like a breathing skin to the building. Now, this is not just restricted to Rajasthan. It travels across the world in many other parts of the world. So even, for example, the Middle East has had these similar architectural elements interpreted in their own language. So I think there's a lot the world has to offer. Like, again, I'm going to refer to the keynote speech made this morning, where it was about literature knows no boundaries. I feel in many ways, architecture knows no boundaries also. But we need to learn the right things from each other rather than aping what one region of the world has into the other.
Dikshu, in your book, and the book is really an opulent, fabulous, it's not just about the history of architecture, it's really, or of the Kukreja group, but it really sort of maps the way architecture has changed over time. In your book, I saw that the CP Kukreja firm has done architectural designs for academic institutions, for hospitals, for large hotels, for new office buildings, for residential complexes. In all of this, I'm assuming the need base for a hospital is quite different from, say, an educational institution, but perhaps somewhat more similar to, say, a hotel building. How do you all plan when you create these plans, and you've done everything from what we see as the India Pavilion in Dubai at the Expo 2020, all the way to the Jawaharlal Nehru University, etc. What's the kind of inputs that you get in creating the designs that you have?
So I think one of the things that has been a thread which has run through all the way till today, a couple of them actually. One is to do with context. For us, it's always that architecture is at one level common sense, but at another level, it's first realizing the context where you're building. I'm appalled and sometimes completely go into a state of shock when people talk about just picking up a design from one part of the world or our own country and planting it into another. How can architecture be given birth to in this kind of a manner? So for me, a very important element has been context. Now, the context can be climatic, it can be cultural, geographical, historical, and many other economical, social. All these things influence. And that's the other thing about this book, that what we are looking at here is that it is about how architecture affects, reflects society and vice versa. It's not something that can ever be practiced in isolation. And the second thread that has run through for these last 5 decades with our architectural approach is sustainability. So if you see those images that are before you of the Jawaharlal Nehru University and the other projects. So this was back 50 years ago. And there was a computer center building, which was the first of its kind to come up in India, where the cost of the computer sitting inside was more than the cost of the building. And at that time, Delhi had power outages. So how do you keep a building cool where you have a computer sitting inside, but you won't have power for 8 hours in a day in a hot climate like Delhi? So, the building was designed in that manner. So all through, one of the important threads has been sustainability. And today, more than ever before.
I'll come to sustainability and smart cities and smart buildings in a second. You talked about the environment. It needs to be reflective of the environment. How do you, especially in India, juxtapose the Antalya's overlooking the slums of Bombay, or people who have no home? Similarly, in Delhi, you have the Connaught Places, or you have the Gurgaons, and under the flyovers, these vast flyovers that connect people and places through the night, you have people sleeping under them. Is there a duty, or is there a responsibility that architects have in designing these buildings to perhaps also provide for the other? In Boulder, Colorado, for example, now the library has been created in a way that ensures that homeless people have a space during the day, not necessarily during the night, but certainly during the day. In Delhi and other places, we're seeing night shelters. What is the responsibility of architects, your profession, to be able to be more empathetic and inclusive in creating an opportunity for these people?
So one of the things I very strongly believe in is that architects, by education and by duty to the profession, are not just people who are supposed to design buildings. I believe, and I would like to stay in that utopia, and invite others to join in that utopian world, that architects have a role to influence society in many ways. And therefore, unless we understand the problems of society as professionals, because our education, the whole pendulum swings right from scientific aspects of chemistry and physics to all the way through sociology and psychology. So when you've studied all these different fields, you should be able to make a difference accordingly in society. So I think it's very important for us to be able to influence or able to encourage society that all these aspects need to be taken care of, or issues which you just brought out. And how does one do that? This, I believe, has a multi-pronged approach. One is that at the government level, at a policy level, we can play a role. For example, you're referring to some of the US cities. I was very surprised when I was there, pleasantly surprised when I was there to find that many mayors of American cities are actually architects by training. So I feel we have that role to influence cities. And in that respect, it's important that at a policy level, we are able to play a role that the policy makers introduce aspects now, whether it's about creating housing under public spaces or many other aspects which the underprivileged need to be offered. And the other role that we can play is not just at policy level, the second role is at the society level. So whether the community that we live in, the residential neighborhood that we live in, or other groups that we participate in, we can start encouraging students, because encouraging communities to participate, because we are people who are trained to come up with ideas. And the third level, which is most important, is that ourselves, when we are designing projects, we do that. So again, to give you an example of the Pathways World School, when we did that school, it was coming up near a village. And we explained to the client that, you have to provide, as per the National Building Code, a water tank for firefighting purposes of 200,000 liters. So rather than creating an underground tank, which water will never be used, why not make a lake out of it? And in that lake, on the bottom of the lake, we decided to do a fantastic mural, which was not designed by us, but it was inspired by the rangoli, or the patterns that the village women create in the neighborhood village. So we invited the women to come there to create those patterns, and from there the design came out.
Dikshu, I'm going to put you on the spot. Every victorious general wants to mark their legacy with creating new cities and new buildings. So whether it was Shah Jahanabad or Tughlaqabad or the new city of Jaipur or the Pink City, in Delhi we are seeing the restructuring of the central vista. Do you have an opinion on that? Was there a need to do that? Is there perhaps a better way to do that? Will it be reflective of Indian design? At this point of time, was it something that should have been done? Could we have instead focused on these needs that you're talking about the needs to be inclusive? Or is it just a mark of a legacy that's being created for vanity projects, which are mostly like, projects of this kind?
So I think if the way I see it, from my eyes, I see India is, at the holistic level, India is beginning to really have a very profound global influence. One sees that around, whether it's the unfortunate war that is taking place in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, and many other places. One is seeing now that the world looks towards India for many aspects to be addressed. From that point of view, I think it's important that, just as you mentioned examples in history, architecture is a very powerful tool to convey what the society or what that nation stands for at a certain particular moment in time. So from that point of view, I think it's important that if India is to make a mark, whether it's in the terms of giving a new shape and language to its capital, or in terms of other public buildings that have to come up, I do believe that whatever we do in India, we must remember that we are a very diverse nation. So we must be able to celebrate the diversity of our country. It's incredibly diverse. So from that perspective, whatever architecture comes up, I hope and I believe should always be reflecting that diversity, celebrating it, and also it should be something which is inclusive. That is very important, and that's the way I look at the architectural approach. For example, you talked about the India Pavilion. When we designed the India Pavilion, we created, I'm told, a world record because we ended up creating 82 different designs for the India Pavilion. And we kept doing that because we were trying to find the ultimate solution that how do you represent India? Do you show another Jaipur and say this is India? Or do you show another Guwahati or a Kerala or a Kashmir? So for us, the search went on till we felt we found the right solution, which was about just creating a great backdrop on which you can celebrate the diversity of the country.
Dikshu, you're talking about diversity, and we know that the architectural traditions across India is incredible, whether it's the wooden architectural form in Kerala, the trellis work that you do in Himachal, the work that you see in Kashmir, or the work that you see across Rajasthan, which is stone and grill. Much of this is not reflected. I mean, look at this building. I mean, we could be anywhere. You know, this convention center is a convention center, wherever. How do we get some of these styles to be represented here? The one great example was that some years ago, one of the things that the government did was they said, let's redo the railway stations in Jaipur and open up some of the museums, but restore them and preserve them and use traditional artisans to be able to do so. How do we get traditional artisans back into the picture in a much larger scale so that that particular art form doesn't die with them?
It's a great question, and it's a very, very important issue, I would say. And I'm going to again say that, you know, it's something that we have to have a multi-pronged approach towards. Again, it cannot be just one person being able to do it, although I know you're doing a phenomenal job in terms of how you're making a transformation. But I think it's very important that we recognize that this talent that we have is unique in the world, and therefore it's something that we all have a responsibility toward. So whether it is you know, somebody building a hotel here in a place like Jaipur, which has the skill set, which has the tradition, which has all the history to it, how they are able to imbibe that and have a responsibility towards involving such craftsmen to anywhere else in the world, in our country. I think we all have that responsibility, and for that, when I say multi-pronged approach, I'm talking about right from the kids who are going to go to that school where they're going to be influenced by Indian architecture and grow up to become maybe the big policymakers of the country or the big businessmen of the country, and therefore great patrons of Indian architecture. I think it's a societal appreciation, a societal change and upliftment or upheaval that needs to happen for this to take place. And I would like to be an optimist here and say that I can see that change. When I interact with clients, when I interact with people, I see that it's now fashionable, which is a good thing, to talk about Indian architecture, to be inspired by Indian architecture, rather than say, oh, you know, I saw this thing on Rodeo Drive, or this is what I saw in Dubai. Can we have it out here as well? I think that trend is changing. And that trend will only increase, the change will increase when people begin to understand what Indian architecture is about. And that's what, through this book, we are trying to do. It's a very, very small, it's a drop in the ocean of what Indian architecture in post-independence India has been about. They are great architects. They are very talented architects in our country, I feel, today, who are doing stellar work. I urge people, and that's why we had our conversation a few months back, and I thank you also, Sanjoy, for bringing architecture to this literary platform.
Dikshu, moving on to, again, going back to what Shambi Sharp said in the morning about this being our only planet, there being no second alternative. And it's not that the planet's going to die, our species is going to annihilate, and it's going to be done by us, not an asteroid or a meteorite. In that context, what's the role? I mean, we're looking at Gurgaon, say, for example, which is an example of smart city to some extent, or certainly smart buildings. What do we need to do? You talked about 40% of building materials right now contribute to, you know, global warming, etc. What do we need to do to be able to look at new technology, both in terms of the building forms as well as the material that is used? And how much of this is going to be reflective in the smart cities that are being built in India or being developed in India, at least the 100 smart cities that are being developed across India?
So I think it is a very serious issue that needs to be addressed, and that is that if we are not going to embrace sustainable design, sustainable technologies, sustainable means of doing construction, we are really headed into a catastrophic situation. So from that perspective, I believe that, of course, onus lies on architects and professionals to be able to influence people around, to explain the importance of choosing the right technologies. The great thing today is that India, with our startups and our Make in India initiatives and all the other things that are going on, it's a country which cannot now say that, you know what, we don't have these resources. We have every possible technology, every possible building material that could be anywhere on this planet is available in India. So we are now literally again spoiled for choice. So the choice that has to be made now is intelligent choices. So for example, Sanjoy, if you recall, we had a conversation once about how when people move from one part of this country, or especially urban migration, when people from rural areas move towards our cities, what they bring in terms of their understanding, how does that influence our cities? I want to talk about the other way around. It does disappoint me sometimes that when you travel to hill stations like Shimla or Dalhousie or these places which have such a charm to them, and you see what even the little new shops that are coming, or the earlier charming mall that was used to be there, now that is being replaced with this metal and glass facades for buildings. Why metal and glass in a hill station? So it's all about us making the wrong choices. We feel that if we create a building which is clad in aluminium, or ACP as we call it, the metal building, or just slap a lot of glass on the facade, it's a modern building. That's where the wrong choice is being made. And that's where I think we as architects and everyone else here who has the intelligence to influence the right choices plays a role.
So how do we bring about the change? I mean, you know, if you look at post independent India, governments have created a lot of infrastructure, but you don't really have the iconic new public buildings, whether it's the museums or their own office spaces. You don't see them anyplace. And they're certainly not reflective of any of what we're talking about. Shimla today is a slum, and primarily much of it, because of the way government buildings have been built, it is beyond ugly. Dehradun, which used to be the most charming sort of little town, retirement town, or Bangalore, which is where, you know, the garden city of India, has been completely transformed and ruined in many ways. How do we bring about a change in mindset, and how do we bring about a change in policy where it comes to government in terms of buildings that are aesthetic and, most importantly, are attuned to the climate crisis?
So I think it's very important. This bothers me a lot as well. It's very important that the decision makers in the government realize that when you are commissioning a building, it's a very important and noble task you're taking on. It's a task or instructions you are issuing for something which is going to last beyond our lifetime. The building is still going to be there. It's very disturbing to see that a lot of times there is a very short-sighted, myopic view in the government of creating infrastructure, creating buildings, but only looking at the capital cost. The operational cost, or OPEX as they say, is ignored. It's only that we only have X amount of money now, so let's just go ahead and do it. And therefore, we delete this, we delete that, and we don't think about the future at all. And that's a sad thing, because really we don't realize that that building is going to cost far longer, because it's going to live an unhealthy life. It's going to be sapping more energy and resources. So why not do it the right way the first time? The second thing I find disturbing is that mega projects happen in the country, but when it comes to devoting the investment or money to artwork or to craftsmanship, that is completely ignored. So, you know, in some cities like Delhi, there is a mandate of the government that 1% of the building cost should be put onto art for use for public art. Now that is also in a way twisted. And what happens is if there's a hotel coming up in Delhi, the walls inside this kind of a room, whatever artwork will happen, they are considered into that 1%. But that 1% was meant for public art. So things like that is something where the government can play a big role in creating buildings which are far more responsible.
You know, in the temple tradition, and today much of India's narrative is around the building of new temples, etc. Temple tradition came from a very established foundation. You know, the nakshatra of the temple had been laid down in the Shastras, and you continue to build. If that is possible to be able to recreate or redo new temples, why aren't we being able to do that in some ways in architectural school? When you build something, these are the kinds of things you need to look at as the nakshatra, which in many ways should be undiluted in the creation of buildings in different regions. So what you have in Hampi is different, or what you have in Bengal is different, and what you have in the north is different, because our climates are different. Yes. Is there a way to be able to create that opportunity or put that into our educational system?
Yes, it should be there. It's missing or has been missing largely so far because the education system in architecture also has been, first of all, it has been derived from the colonial mindset. And the other incident or other direction what took place was that when India gained independence, for example, Prime Minister Nehru commissioned Chandigarh, and and then even Mrs. Indira Gandhi was responsible for setting up Delhi Urban Arts Commission and things like that. So there was some sort of a significance being attached to architecture, but largely what happened was with the coming of, let's say, the CPWD or the Central Public Works Department, it became a completely engineering-driven mindset. So the architecture part got relegated. Our buildings became really a prerogative of engineers rather than architects. Now, both have an equally important role to play. So therefore, one being pushed to the background will have a detrimental effect. And that's what has happened. But before you ask me the next question, I'm tempted to ask you something here. You have such a passion towards art and culture, and you are playing a stellar role in the country. There is no doubt about that. Where do you see, from your perspective, where do you see art and architecture or cultural aspects of India coming together and being reflected in architecture? Where do you see the marriage?
Dikshu, I don't see that there is a difference. I believe that architecture is or should be reflective of our ecosystem, of our traditions, of our art, our culture, our heritage, our tradition, and tell a story. That's what any aesthetic form is. It tells a story. Here, for example, I keep referring back to this building. It doesn't tell me a story, and that's the disappointment. Until and unless we're able to place ourselves in earlier times, your name used to be reflective of where you were or who you were, your caste, your village, your father, and so on and so forth. Yes, through migration, much of that we've lost. But sadly, we've also lost the sense of belonging. And when we were talking about migration, Dikshu, that's one of the big issues, right? We migrate from rural to urban, we migrate between urban places. I was born somewhere, I've grown up somewhere else. And in that, we lose something, but we also gain. We gain the diversity that we have. But what is it that we can do through art and architecture and tradition and knowledge and education and science and technology to be able to pull it all together? Why do we look at it as separate things? Art is not separate from aesthetics, neither is it from architecture, neither is it from science and technology, because all of this comes together when we are creating anything of importance. I think that's something that perhaps our school system, our education system has failed us, and we have failed them by continuing to say, oh, this is liberal arts, so this is what it is, this is science, this is the STEM subjects, this is what it is, and never the twain should meet. That wasn't so before, and to be able for an artist to envision something and to create that vision of what he's envisioned, he needs the science and technology. For the scientist to be able to send somebody off to space and the Hubble or the Webb or whatever, they need that out of the box thinking, the innovation to be able to do that, so it's interesting. But Dikshu, last question, because we're running out of time, is again, in your book, you've looked at residential complexes, and you've looked at some beautiful buildings. Why is it that when you look at low cost housing, that by and large government does, or government then contracts architects and builders to do, why does it always have to be so dismal, not just in India, but across the world? When the minute you look at low cost housing, it's ghettoization, it's one above the other. It sort of brings it all down to that below average life experience. How do we expect people to aspire to move beyond themselves in that kind of environment?
So this is something which is actually ironical, because when you are designing something for, let's say, the less privileged people in our society, so the income level is less, and therefore the building that you're providing might be smaller in size. If you're giving them a habitat, it might be smaller than, let's say, a luxury unit. It doesn't take away from the fact that you can still create something which is very charming, very attractive. So you can have simpler, modest finishes. You don't need to go for foreign materials like stones, etc., being imported from other parts of the world. But again, like I said, we have so much to be inspired from in our own country, where you have the local materials. So whether it's in Kerala or whether it's in Madhya Pradesh, you have local stones, natural materials, which you can use, many, many natural materials. I think it's more about the mindset. It starts with a mindset where we are here to provide something which has to be minimum. I think that's not the way to look at it. It should be about how you can really give something better in that space. So let's say if we are making housing for the less privileged, you can create more open spaces for them, and those open spaces become more community level spaces. So if their living room, for example, might be small, but if you give a shared community space outside, they themselves would be happy to spend time, just the way we do in our rural communities. When you go to the hinterlands of the country, people love to spend time outside. They have their charpai outside, and they're spending the day there, rather than confined in their little habitat inside. So there are many, many ways to do that. The second thing I always talk about is that why don't we take advantage of a beautiful thing nature has given us, and that's color. We can always, where you can't use too expensive materials, you can bring in a play of color and change life completely and make it so much more vibrant. So there are many ways to approach this. It's about the mindset first. I think that's where the problem lies.
It's finally about the mindset. All our viewers listening in from across the world, thank you all for tuning in. Architecture, aesthetics, arts, tradition, they all come together. And we need to do much more to be able to make sense of this. I mean, there are many more questions that I would love to have asked Dikshu. Unfortunately, right now, our connection is down, and I need to apologize to those people who've sent in their questions online. I promise we'll get the system working, and we'll continue in the next few sessions. Ambassador, Ms. Kukreja, Dikshu, thank you so much for being here, for bringing to us this particular session. I do hope we can continue this trend of looking at art and architecture. And I'm going to ask the ambassador, Norway, Sweden, much of the Nordic countries excel in design and form. And perhaps we should look at a series going forward where we look at bringing in some of your designers and we have a conversation and discussion. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening in. Thank you, Dikshu. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd just like to announce here that it's an interesting development which is going to take place, that starting next month, I'm hosting a television series which is called A Tale of Two Cities. And it's going to be on Beyond TV channel. And what that's going to be doing is where I'll be interacting with the mayors of different cities from across the world and comparing that with one Indian city. So it will be one global city and one Indian city, so that we can learn from each other. There's so much out there that we can learn from each other and make our own cities world class.
effluent control devices or APCDs, air pollution control devices. Basically, the design is missing. You have rightly pointed out that the new technology has to be introduced. So we must have some designers who can design very good these CETPs, even common effluent treatment plants, which are there. Those are not being maintained properly in India.
No, in fact,
So-
you're absolutely right, because we're going to run out of time. We'll come and
so-
answer the question. But just to quickly tell you, we have a series called Be Inspired, which is with the principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister of India,
Yes.
Vijay Raghavan's office. And in there, we've received a number of new suggestions after the architecture session. One of them was, in fact, to how to reduce PM10 and PM20
yes.
particles, etc., during in-building complexes. And who sent this? 2 young people living in the semi-urban areas of Bangalore. But we'll have this conversation.
NGT is there, but they are only taking care of 25% of the
Totally.
So
agree.
NGT also has to be revamped.
Absolutely.
If this message goes to the government,
Sure.
I shall be grateful, because Mr. Sanjoy, you can do it, Mr. Kukreja.
Thank you
can
so
definitely
much.
do it.
Thank you so much.
Send the message, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We would like to thank Mr. Dikshu Kukreja, Ms. Arunima Kukreja, His Excellency Hans Jacob Frydenlund, and Sanjoy Roy for a riveting discussion and the great book launch. And we hope to see you in the following sessions of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Just to announce, Mr. Kukreja will be available to sign books outside in the stall that you find for the Darbar Hall. So please feel free to take your books and get it signed by Mr. Kukreja. And please also help us in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bins placed around the premises. And we hope to see you in the following sessions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Mariam Kakar. Yes, since 2019 I joined the library as a member. Then